Sarah Thompson sat quietly in her AP chemistry class, her dark hands carefully adjusting the safety goggles as she prepared for their lab experiment. At 15, she was one of the youngest students in the advanced placement course, and her lab report from last week had earned her another perfect score. The late September sun streamed through the classroom windows, creating patterns on her perfectly pressed school uniform. The classroom door suddenly burst open. Officer Rebecca Mills strode in, her boots making sharp sounds against the tile floor. The school resource officer's blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her face set in what some students called her hunting expression. Sarah's heart sank as the officer's cold blue eyes locked onto her. "Random security check," Officer Mills announced, though her gaze never left Sarah. This was the third random check this month, and somehow, Sarah was always selected. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, especially Maria Rodriguez, who had witnessed every single one of these incidents. Dr. Patterson, the chemistry teacher, cleared his throat. "Officer Mills, we're in the middle of a crucial experiment. Perhaps this could wait until—" "Security doesn't wait, Dr. Patterson," Officer Mills cut him off. "Thompson, grab your bag, now." Sarah carefully removed her safety goggles and stood up, her legs feeling weak. Her lab partner, Jason Chen, gave her a sympathetic look as she picked up her backpack. She could feel 24 pairs of eyes following her as Officer Mills practically marched her out of the classroom. In the empty hallway, Officer Mills pointed to a spot against the lockers. "You know the drill. Empty your bag." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened her backpack. One by one, she removed her items: textbooks, notebooks, calculator, pencil case, and her packed lunch. Officer Mills watched with an unsettling intensity, her hand resting on her belt near her taser. "What's in the pencil case?" Mills demanded. "Just pencils and erasers, ma'am," Sarah replied softly, unzipping it to show its contents. Officer Mills snorted. "You people always think you're so smart, don't you? Getting into AP classes, trying to prove something." Sarah's throat tightened at the comment, but she remained silent. Her parents had taught her well: when dealing with hostile authority figures, stay calm and don't give them any reason to escalate. "What's this?" Mills suddenly snatched a small white bottle from the bottom of Sarah's bag. "My inhaler, ma'am. I have asthma. The school nurse has my prescription on file." Mills shook the inhaler suspiciously. "Could be hiding something in here. Wouldn't be the first time I've caught students getting creative with their hiding spots." From around the corner, the sound of a phone camera clicking echoed in the quiet hallway. Mills whirled around, but whoever had taken the photo was already gone. "Who's there?" Mills shouted, her face reddening. When no one answered, she turned back to Sarah, her expression even darker than before. "You setting me up, Thompson? Getting your little friends to spy on me?" "No, ma'am," Sarah answered truthfully. She hadn't arranged anything, though she silently thanked whoever had documented this moment. Officer Mills threw the inhaler back into Sarah's bag, scattering her carefully organized belongings across the floor. "Pick it up, and don't think I don't know what you're up to. I've been doing this job long enough to spot trouble when I see it." Sarah knelt down, gathering her books and papers while fighting back tears. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give Officer Mills that satisfaction. As she collected her things, Sarah's hand brushed against her phone in her blazer pocket. Her aunt's last text message had been clear: "Document everything. Times, dates, witnesses. I'm building a case." Sarah wished she could tell Officer Mills about her aunt, about the fact that Special Agent Diane Carter of the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been quietly gathering evidence for months. But she kept quiet, remembering her aunt's words about the importance of timing. "Get back to class," Mills ordered, already turning away. "And Thompson, I've got my eye on you." Sarah walked back into the chemistry classroom, holding her head high despite the whispers and stares. As she settled back into her seat, she noticed Maria quickly hiding her phone under her desk. Their eyes met briefly, and Maria gave her a small nod. Dr. Patterson paused in his lecture. "Everything all right, Miss Thompson?" Sarah managed a small smile. "Yes, sir. May I have the notes for what I missed?" As Jason quietly shared his notebook with her, Sarah's mind was already calculating the minutes until she could call her aunt. Today's incident would make an important addition to the growing file of Officer Mills' targeted harassment. The date of reckoning was coming, but for now, Sarah had a chemistry experiment to complete. Over the next few weeks, evidence against Officer Mills began piling up like autumn leaves on the school grounds. Maria Rodriguez had become the unofficial leader of what students now called Operation Documentation, coordinating a network of watchful eyes and ready phones throughout Madison High School. During lunch period, Maria sat with Sarah in the crowded cafeteria, their heads bent over Maria's phone as they reviewed the latest recordings. "Look at this one from yesterday," Maria whispered, sliding her finger across the screen. She made Jamal empty his entire gym bag in the middle of basketball practice. The video clearly showed Officer Mills dumping the contents of a sports bag while the basketball team watched helplessly. Jamal Williams, the team captain, stood silently as his shoes, water bottle, and practice uniform scattered across the gymnasium floor. "Did you notice she never does these random checks on any of the white students?" Sarah pointed out, picking at her untouched sandwich. Her appetite had been scarce since the incidents began increasing. "Oh, we noticed." A new voice joined their conversation. Emily Parker, a sophomore with bright red hair and freckles, slid into the seat across from them. She pulled out her own phone. "I've been keeping a spreadsheet of every search she's done this semester. Want to see the statistics?" Sarah and Maria leaned forward as Emily showed them a detailed chart. In the past month alone, she's conducted 46 random searches. 43 of them were students of color. The other 3 were white kids who hang out with Black or Hispanic students. "That's," Sarah started. "Racial profiling," Maria finished, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Clear as day." Emily nodded. "My mom's a statistician. She says these numbers are statistically impossible to be random. There's like a 0.001% chance or something." Just then, they spotted Officer Mills entering the cafeteria. The room's normal chatter dimmed slightly as she began her usual patrol between the tables. At least 12 phones discreetly emerged from pockets and bags, ready to record any incidents. "Delete that spreadsheet," Sarah whispered urgently to Emily. "If she sees it." Emily smiled. "Already ahead of you. It's saved in the cloud, and I've shared it with your aunt. My mom helped make sure all the data is properly organized for legal purposes." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her classmates. What had started as her personal nightmare had somehow united students across different grades and social groups. Even teachers had begun to take notice, though most seemed hesitant to challenge Officer Mills directly. "Watch out," Maria muttered. "She's coming this way." Officer Mills stopped at their table, her shadow falling across their lunch trays. Well, what's this little meeting about?" "Just discussing our calculus homework, ma'am," Emily replied smoothly, her phone already hidden away. Mills' eyes narrowed as she scanned their table. "Thompson, where's your student ID? You know it's supposed to be visible at all times." Sarah reached for the ID card hanging around her neck, but Mills was faster. She snatched the lanyard, examining the card with exaggerated scrutiny. "This photo looks outdated," Mills declared, though Sarah had taken it just 2 months ago at the start of the school year. "It's this year's ID, Officer Mills," Sarah replied quietly. "You can check with the office." "Are you talking back to me?" Mills' voice rose slightly, attracting attention from nearby tables. The subtle sounds of multiple phones recording filled the air like a whisper. "No, ma'am, just providing information." Mills released the ID, letting it snap back against Sarah's chest. "You 3 need to separate. No group meetings without prior approval." "That's not a school rule," Maria said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It is when I say it is," Mills shot back. "Now move, or you'll all get detention for insubordination." As the girls gathered their things, Sarah noticed Mr. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, watching from across the cafeteria. He was frowning as he typed something on his phone. Later that day, Sarah would learn that several teachers had begun documenting Officer Mills' behavior too, quietly building their own file of concerning incidents. That evening, as Sarah added the day's events to her growing digital diary, she received a text from her aunt. "Keep it up, honey. The evidence is becoming impossible to ignore. Justice takes time, but it's coming." Sarah looked at her reflection in the darkened window of her bedroom. The girl who stared back wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of something bigger, a movement for change that was growing stronger every day. Tomorrow would bring more documentation, more evidence, and one day closer to the truth being revealed. The school assembly that Wednesday started like any other. Students filed into the gymnasium, filling the bleachers while Principal Davidson discussed upcoming events and achievements. Sarah sat between Maria and Emily, half listening to the announcements about next week's homecoming game. Everything changed when Officer Mills burst through the gym doors during Principal Davidson's speech about academic excellence. Her boots echoed against the wooden floor as she marched straight toward the bleachers where Sarah sat. The entire gymnasium fell silent, hundreds of students watching the scene unfold. "Sarah Thompson," Officer Mills called out, her voice bouncing off the walls. "Come down here immediately." Principal Davidson posed mid-sentence, his hand still holding the microphone. "Officer Mills, we're in the middle of." "This is a serious security matter," Mills interrupted, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "We received an anonymous tip about illegal substances." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she stood up. Around her, phones emerged silently from pockets and bags. The entire student body had become expert documentarians over the past months, and this moment would be captured from dozens of angles. "Officer Mills," Sarah said clearly, her voice stronger than she felt, "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's for me to determine," Mills snapped. "Bring your bag and come down here. Now." As Sarah made her way down the bleachers, she heard the subtle clicks of phone cameras and saw the tiny red dots of recording lights. Even some teachers had their phones out, including Mr. Rodriguez and Dr. Patterson. When Sarah reached the gym floor, Mills grabbed her backpack roughly. "Hold out your arms. Don't you need probable cause?" Someone called from the bleachers. It sounded like Jason Chen. "Stay out of this," Mills shouted back, her face reddening. She dumped the contents of Sarah's backpack onto the gym floor. Books, notebooks, and pencils scattered across the polished wood. Principal Davidson stepped forward. "Officer Mills, this is highly irregular. If you have concerns, we should discuss this in my office." "Found it," Mills suddenly exclaimed, holding up a small white bottle triumphantly. It was Sarah's asthma inhaler, the same one that had been checked and verified by the school nurse months ago. "That's my prescribed inhaler," Sarah stated calmly, though her hands were shaking. "It's registered with the school nurse." "Oh, really?" Mills sneered. "Then you won't mind if we test it for illegal substances." She began unscrewing the inhaler, her hands clumsy with eagerness. "Officer Mills." A sharp voice cut through the tension. Miss Carter, the school nurse, was hurrying across the gym floor. "That inhaler was verified by me at the start of the semester. I have the prescription documentation in my office." "Prescriptions can be faked," Mills insisted, still trying to dismantle the inhaler. "And searching a student without probable cause during a school assembly can be grounds for suspension," another voice added. Mr. Harrison, the school's legal counsel, had appeared beside Principal Davidson. His usually friendly face was stern as he filmed the scene with his phone. Mills faltered for the first time, looking around at the sea of phones pointed in her direction. I received an anonymous tip." "About a student with a perfect disciplinary record?" Mr. Harrison asked. "A student who maintains a 4.0 GPA and volunteers at the local children's hospital." "That student?" The gymnasium was completely silent now. Even the usual whispers had ceased as everyone watched Officer Mills' demeanor crack slightly. "This is blatant harassment," Ms. Carter declared, picking up Sarah's scattered belongings. "And it's been documented multiple times." Mills' face had lost its triumphant look, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. She glanced around at the hundreds of phones recording her every move, at the teachers who had stepped forward in support, and at Sarah, who stood tall despite the public humiliation. "We'll discuss this in my office," Principal Davidson said firmly. "Right now." His voice carried authority that even Mills couldn't ignore. As Officer Mills followed Principal Davidson out of the gymnasium, the assembled students broke into spontaneous applause. Sarah felt Maria and Emily hurrying down to hug her, joined by dozens of other students offering support. "I got everything on video," Jason called out. "In HD." "Me too." "Same here." The chorus of supporters grew as Sarah collected her belongings. Through her tears, She managed to smile. This time, Officer Mills had gone too far. This time, there were hundreds of witnesses and undeniable proof. Later that afternoon, as Sarah sat in Principal Davidson's office giving her statement, her phone buzzed with a message from her aunt. Just saw the videos. I'm on my way. The school assembly that Wednesday started like any other. Students filed into the gymnasium, filling the bleachers while Principal Davidson discussed upcoming events and achievements. Sarah sat between Maria and Emily, half listening to the announcements about next week's homecoming game. Everything changed when Officer Mills burst through the gym doors during Principal Davidson's speech about academic excellence. Her boots echoed against the wooden floor as she marched straight toward the bleachers where Sarah sat. The entire gymnasium fell silent, hundreds of students watching the scene unfold. Sarah Thompson, Officer Mills called out, her voice bouncing off the walls, "Come down here immediately." Principal Davidson posed mid-sentence, his hand still holding the microphone. "Officer Mills, we're in the middle of." "This is a serious security matter," Mills interrupted, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "We received an anonymous tip about illegal substances." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she stood up. Around her, phones emerged silently from pockets and bags. The entire student body had become expert documentarians over the past months, and this moment would be captured from dozens of angles. "Officer Mills," Sarah said clearly, her voice stronger than she felt, "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's for me to determine," Mills snapped. "Bring your bag and come down here. Now." As Sarah made her way down the bleachers, she heard the subtle clicks of phone cameras and saw the tiny red dots of recording lights. Even some teachers had their phones out, including Mr. Rodriguez and Dr. Patterson. When Sarah reached the gym floor, Mills grabbed her backpack roughly. "Hold out your arms." "Don't you need probable cause?" someone called from the bleachers. It sounded like Jason Chen. "Stay out of this," Mills shouted back, her face reddening. She dumped the contents of Sarah's backpack onto the gym floor. Books, notebooks, and pencils scattered across the polished wood. Principal Davidson stepped forward. "Officer Mills, this is highly irregular. If you have concerns, we should discuss this in my office." "Found it!" Mills suddenly exclaimed, holding up a small white bottle triumphantly. It was Sarah's asthma inhaler, the same one that had been checked and verified by the school nurse months ago. "That's my prescribed inhaler," Sarah stated calmly, though her hands were shaking. "It's registered with the school nurse." "Oh, really?" Mills sneered. "Then you won't mind if we test it for illegal substances." She began unscrewing the inhaler, her hands clumsy with eagerness. "Officer Mills." A sharp voice cut through the tension. "Miss Carter," the school nurse, was hurrying across the gym floor. "That inhaler was verified by me at the start of the semester. I have the prescription documentation in my office." "Prescriptions can be faked," Mills insisted, still trying to dismantle the inhaler. "And searching a student without probable cause during a school assembly can be grounds for suspension," another voice added. Mr. Harrison, the school's legal counsel, had appeared beside Principal Davidson. His usually friendly face was stern as he filmed the scene with his phone. Mills faltered for the first time, looking around at the sea of phones pointed in her direction. I received an anonymous tip about a student with a perfect disciplinary record," Mr. Harrison asked. "A student who maintains a 4.0 GPA and volunteers at the local children's hospital. That student?" The gymnasium was completely silent now. Even the usual whispers had ceased as everyone watched Officer Mills' demeanor crack slightly. "This is blatant harassment," Ms. Carter declared, picking up Sarah's scattered belongings. "And it's been documented. Multiple times." Mills' face had lost its triumphant look, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. She glanced around at the hundreds of phones recording her every move, at the teachers who had stepped forward in support, and at Sarah, who stood tall despite the public humiliation. "We'll discuss this in my office," Principal Davidson said firmly. "Right now." His voice carried authority that even Mills couldn't ignore. As Officer Mills followed Principal Davidson out of the gymnasium, the assembled students broke into spontaneous applause. Sarah felt Maria and Emily hurrying down to hug her, joined by dozens of other students offering support. "I got everything on video," Jason called out. "In HD." "Me too." "Same here." The chorus of supporters grew as Sarah collected her belongings. Through her tears, she managed to smile. This time, Officer Mills had gone too far. This time, there were hundreds of witnesses and undeniable proof. Later that afternoon, as Sarah sat in Principal Davidson's office giving her statement, her phone buzzed with a message from her aunt. "Just saw the videos. I'm on my way." The school board meeting that afternoon was unlike any other in Madison High School's history. The usual small conference room had been abandoned in favor of the auditorium to accommodate the crowd. Students, parents, teachers, and community members filled the seats, their whispers creating a steady hum of anticipation. Officer Mills sat at a table near the front, her usual confident posture replaced by nervous fidgeting. Her police union representative sat beside her, shuffling through papers with growing concern. They had expected a standard disciplinary hearing, not this. The board members filed in, taking their seats on the stage. Principal Davidson looked particularly uncomfortable as he adjusted his microphone. "Before we begin today's proceedings, if I may," Agent Carter interrupted, standing from her position in the front row. "The FBI Civil Rights Division would like to present its findings first." A murmur rippled through the crowd as 3 more FBI agents walked down the center aisle, carrying boxes of files. Officer Mills' face paled visibly as she watched them set up a projector screen. "Over the past 4 months," Agent Carter began, her voice filling the auditorium, "we documented a disturbing pattern of racial discrimination and abuse of authority." She clicked her remote, and a series of photographs appeared on the screen, each showing Officer Mills conducting random searches of minority students. But these incidents at Madison High are just the tip of the iceberg. Another click, another series of images. Officer Mills has a history that spans 3 different school districts across 2 states. The police union representative leaned over to whisper something to Mills, but she shook her head sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the table. At Riverside High in 2021, Agent Carter continued. Officer Mills resigned after multiple complaints of targeting Hispanic students. At Washington Central in 2022, she left following similar accusations involving Asian American students. Each time, she was allowed to quietly move on to another district. The projector showed a chart tracking Mills' movement between schools, along with the corresponding spike in discriminatory incidents at each location. The evidence was overwhelming. "We have sworn statements from students at all 3 schools." Agent Carter nodded to her colleagues, who began distributing thick folders to the board members. "We have statistical analysis showing the mathematical impossibility of these searches being truly random. And now, thanks to the brave students of Madison High, we have video evidence." The screen lit up with footage from yesterday's assembly, showing Mills' public harassment of Sarah. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every word, every accusation, and the eventual intervention by school staff. "This ends today," Agent Carter declared, turning to face the board. "The FBI is formally recommending immediate termination and a full review of all security protocols. Additionally, we're opening investigations into the administrators who enabled this behavior at previous schools." Officer Mills suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand. These kids are protected by the Constitution." Agent Carter cut her off. "The same Constitution you swore to uphold." She turned back to the board. "We prepared a comprehensive report detailing every incident, complete with witness statements, video evidence, and statistical analysis." The board members looked shell-shocked as they flipped through the folders. The chairwoman, Mrs. Rodriguez, adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. "This is extremely thorough. The federal government takes civil rights violations very seriously," one of the other FBI agents added, "especially when they target minors in educational settings." From her seat in the audience, Sarah watched as Officer Mills seemed to deflate, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. The officer's face had lost its usual stern expression, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Principal Davidson cleared his throat. "Given this new information, I move to immediately terminate Officer Mills' employment and launch a full review of our security policies." "Seconded," another board member quickly added. The vote was unanimous. As Officer Mills was escorted out by 2 of the FBI agents, the auditorium erupted in applause. Sarah felt Maria squeeze her hand on one side and Emily on the other. Agent Carter gathered her materials, catching Sarah's eye with a small wink. This wasn't just about removing one problematic officer, it was about setting a precedent. Schools across the district would be watching, learning, and hopefully changing. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah overheard one board member say to another, "We need to make sure this never happens again." "Oh, it won't," Agent Carter replied, closing her briefcase with a definitive click. "We'll make sure of that." 1 week after the explosive school board meeting, Officer Mills sat nervously in front of the Police Internal Affairs Review Board. The small hearing room felt suffocating as 5 senior officers reviewed the mountain of evidence against her. Her once pristine uniform looked wrinkled, and dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. "Officer Rebecca Mills," Chief Anderson began, his voice stern and disappointed, "the evidence presented here today is deeply troubling. Not only did you engage in racial profiling at Madison High School, but you also failed to disclose your previous disciplinary issues when applying for this position." Mills shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her union representative had advised her to say nothing, but the weight of silence was becoming unbearable. "Let's review the numbers," Lieutenant Garcia continued, opening a thick folder. "In your 6 months at Madison High, you conducted 157 random searches. Of these, 149 targeted minority students. The statistical probability of this occurring by chance is essentially 0. Another officer, Captain Williams, leaned forward. "And then there's the matter of your previous positions. 3 schools in 3 years, each with similar patterns of behavior." "I was just doing my job," Mills finally burst out, her voice cracking. "These searches were necessary for school safety." "Were they?" Chief Anderson interrupted, pulling out a document. "Because according to school records, the only drug-related incidents during your tenure involved students you never searched. Your targeting of minority students actually reduced overall security by focusing resources in the wrong places." The room fell silent as this information sank in. Mills' hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. "Furthermore," Lieutenant Garcia added, "we have concerns about your use of intimidation tactics. Multiple students reported feeling threatened during these searches, including one asthmatic student whose medical device you repeatedly targeted." At the mention of Sarah, Mills' face reddened. That inhaler could have been exactly what it was, a prescribed medical device. Captain Williams cut in, which the school nurse had already verified. Twice. Chief Anderson stood up, pacing behind the review panel's table. "Officer Mills, your actions have not only violated department policy and federal law, but they've also damaged community trust in law enforcement. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Mills nodded slowly, reality finally seeming to sink in. "The FBI Civil Rights Division has provided extensive documentation," Lieutenant Garcia continued, "including evidence that you deliberately concealed your disciplinary history when applying for positions. This is a serious breach of protocol." Captain Williams picked up another file. "We've received statements from your previous supervisors. It seems you were allowed to resign quietly each time, avoiding formal disciplinary action. That stops today." Chief Anderson returned to his seat, his expression grave. "This board recommends immediate termination of your employment with the department. Additionally, we're recommending revocation of your law enforcement certification." Mills gasped. Without certification, she could never work as a police officer again. "You'll also be required to cooperate fully with the ongoing FBI investigation into civil rights violations at all 3 schools," Lieutenant Garcia added. "Your union representative can explain the details of that process." Captain Williams closed his folder with finality. "Officer Mills, your badge and service weapon." With trembling hands, Mills removed her badge and placed it on the table, followed by her service weapon. The metal made a soft thud against the wood, seeming to echo in the quiet room. "The department will issue a formal apology to the students and families affected by your actions," Chief Anderson concluded. "We're also implementing new screening procedures to prevent similar situations in the future." As Mills left the hearing room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She passed by another waiting area. Through the glass, she caught a glimpse of Sarah Thompson and her aunt, Agent Carter, speaking with other FBI agents. They were probably there to provide additional testimony, but they wouldn't need to now. The heavy door closed behind her with a final sounding click. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with news alerts. The story had already broken. Former school resource officer faces consequences for systemic discrimination. Read one headline. Mills walked slowly through the police station, past officers who avoided eye contact. Her career was over, but more importantly, her actions would serve as a warning to others who might abuse their authority. Sometimes, justice comes not just through punishment, but through lasting change in the system itself. 2 months after Officer Mills' termination, Madison High School was a different place. The morning sun streamed through the hallway windows as Sarah Thompson walked to her first class, no longer feeling the need to look over her shoulder or double-check her ID badge. Principal Davidson stood at the school entrance, greeting students alongside Mr. Chen, the school's new security liaison. Unlike Mills' intimidating presence, Mr. Chen chatted warmly with students, learning their names and interests. His approach to school safety focused on building relationships rather than suspicion. "Good morning, Sarah," Mr. Chen called out with a friendly wave. "Debate team meeting at lunch today, right?" Sarah nodded, smiling. The debate team had recently taken on school security policies as their main topic, and Mr. Chen had been surprisingly supportive of their research. In the main office, a newly installed bulletin board displayed the school's updated security protocols, drafted with input from students, parents, and civil rights experts. A QR code linked to an anonymous reporting system where students could report concerns about discriminatory practices. Maria jogged up beside her, carrying a stack of flyers. "The school board approved our proposal. They're implementing the Student Oversight Committee next month." This was the change Sarah was most proud of. After Mills' departure, she and her classmates had proposed a committee where student representatives would work directly with security staff to ensure fair treatment and open communication. During third period, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her aunt. "Great news! 3 more school districts have adopted the Madison model for security reform. You started something big, kiddo." The Madison model, as it was now being called, had gained national attention. News outlets had covered the story, focusing not just on Mills' misconduct, but on the positive changes that followed. Sarah had even been interviewed by the local newspaper, though she made sure to credit her fellow students and supportive teachers. At lunch, Sarah sat with the Student Oversight Committee in the library. Emily was presenting data from their first monthly security audit. "Look at these numbers," Emily said excitedly, pulling up a spreadsheet. "Security checks are down 60%, but actual safety incidents are down too. Turns out treating students with respect actually makes the school safer." Jason Chen, who had joined the committee after witnessing Sarah's chemistry class incident, nodded in agreement. "Mr. Chen, no relation, by the way, actually helped me start a peer mediation program. We're resolving conflicts before they become security issues." Dr. Patterson stuck his head into the library. "Sarah, do you have a minute? There's someone here to see you." In the hallway, Sarah found Agent Carter waiting with a distinguished-looking woman in a business suit. "Sarah, this is Ms. Roberts from the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office." Agent Carter introduced them. "She's here to learn about the changes you've helped implement." Ms. Roberts shook Sarah's hand warmly. "Your school's transformation has caught our attention. We're considering using the Madison model as a template for national guidelines on school security reform." Sarah felt a surge of pride, not just for herself, but for everyone who had stood up against injustice. "It was a team effort," she said modestly. "That's exactly why it works," Ms. Roberts replied. "You didn't just remove one problematic officer, you changed the entire system." Later that afternoon, Sarah passed by Officer Mills' old office, now transformed into the Student Safety Resource Center. Through the window, she could see Mr. Chen meeting with a group of students, his body language open and encouraging. A poster on the wall read, "Security through community, not fear." At her locker, Sarah found a note from Principal Davidson requesting her presence at next week's school board meeting. They wanted her to present the first comprehensive report on the new security policy's effectiveness. As she gathered her books, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. Mills' actions had exposed a broken system, but the response had created something better. Students felt safer, teachers were more engaged, and the new security approach had become a model for other schools. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her aunt. Just heard from the FBI director. They're using Madison High as a case study for training new civil rights investigators. Your story is making waves, Sarah. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person brave enough to stand up. Sarah smiled, closing her locker. The halls of Madison High were filled with chatter and laughter, students from all backgrounds moving freely without fear. This was what real school safety looked like, not through intimidation and discrimination, but through respect, understanding, and community. 1 year after the events that transformed Madison High School, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a national conference on school safety reform. The large auditorium was packed with educators, law enforcement officials, and civil rights advocates from across the country. What happened at Madison High wasn't just about one officer, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. It was about recognizing that true security comes from building trust, not creating fear. In the front row, she could see familiar faces. Maria and Emily were there representing the Student Oversight Committee. Principal Davidson sat with other school administrators, and Mr. Chen was taking notes for his upcoming training session on community-based security approaches. The Madison model has now been implemented in over 50 schools across the country. Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. In every case, we've seen improved safety metrics alongside dramatically reduced complaints of discrimination. Agent Carter watched proudly from the side of the stage. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had turned the Madison High case into a mandatory training module for law enforcement officers working in educational settings. The ripple effects had gone far beyond what anyone had expected. Sarah shared statistics from the past year: security incidents down 70%, student reporting of concerns up 85%, parent and teacher satisfaction with school safety at an all-time high, but the numbers only tell part of the story. She gestured to a group of students from different schools who stood up in the audience. These are the real champions of change, students who took our model and adapted it for their own communities. Each school is different, but the principles remain the same: respect, transparency, and meaningful student involvement in security decisions. From somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, Sarah spotted Rebecca Mills. The former officer had been required to attend these conferences as part of her settlement agreement. Mills looked different now, humbled, perhaps even enlightened by the experience. She caught Sarah's eye and gave a small, apologetic nod. "We didn't just replace one security officer," Sarah explained. "We rebuilt the entire approach to school safety. Our Student Oversight Committee meets monthly with security staff. Our anonymous reporting system ensures that concerns are addressed promptly and fairly. And most importantly, every student knows they have a voice in how their school handles safety." In the back of the room, journalists scribbled notes. The Madison model had become a hot topic in educational circles, with research papers and policy studies examining its effectiveness. Sarah's own college applications have been strengthened by her role in developing and implementing these reforms. "But our work isn't finished," Sarah said, approaching her conclusion. "Every day, we hear from new schools wanting to implement these changes. Every week, another district reaches out for guidance. This is how real change happens, not through force or fear, but through community, understanding, and persistent effort." The applause was thunderous as Sarah finished her speech. As she left the stage, she was surrounded by educators wanting to learn more about implementing similar reforms in their schools. Principal Davidson beamed with pride as he watched his student become the teacher. Later that evening, at a small celebration dinner, Sarah sat with her family, friends, and the key players who had supported the changes at Madison High. Agent Carter raised her glass in a toast. "To Sarah," she began, "who showed us that sometimes the youngest voices speak the loudest truths." "To all of us," Sarah corrected gently. "Every student who recorded evidence, every teacher who spoke up, every administrator who supported change. This was never about just one person." As conversations flowed around the table, Sarah's phone lit up with messages from students at other schools, sharing their own success stories with the Madison model. A photo from Jason showed the newly painted mural at Madison High's entrance. "Safety through unity," written in bright, bold letters. Principal Davidson leaned over to Sarah. "You know, When you graduate this spring, we're going to need someone to train the next generation of student leaders. Sarah smiled. I think Maria's sophomore sister would be perfect for that. She's already organizing workshops for incoming freshmen. The legacy would continue, passing from student to student, school to school. What had started as one officer's discrimination had transformed into a nationwide movement for positive change. As Sarah looked around at the faces of those who had supported her journey, she realized that sometimes the worst experiences could lead to the best outcomes, if you were brave enough to stand up and work for change. The sun was setting over Washington, D.C. as the celebration continued, casting a warm glow through the windows. Tomorrow, more schools would adopt the Madison model. More students would find their voices, and the ripples of change would continue to spread, one school at a time.